From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
House Speaker Kevin McCarthy and a bipartisan group of legislators meet with Taiwan's President Tsai Ing-wen at the Reagan Presidential Library in Simi Valley, California, risking the wrath of China. What does that tell us about the state of U.S.-China relations? Plus, Tricia Cotham, a Democrat in the North Carolina legislature, jumps to the Republican Party, giving the GOP a supermajority that can override Democratic Governor Roy Cooper's veto. Why she did it may surprise you. Welcome. I'm Paul Gigot with the Wall Street Journal opinion pages, and I'm here with Kim Strassel and Kate Batchelder-Odell. Welcome to you both. Let's talk about the meeting in California, historic meeting. First meeting between a U.S. Speaker and the President of Taiwan on U.S. soil. Let's listen to Speaker McCarthy, followed by the President of Taiwan.
Taiwan is a successful democracy, a thriving economy, and a global leader in health and science. And whether it's our deep commercial ties, strong people-to-people relationships, our shared values, our cooperation with the people of Taiwan continue to expand through dialogue and exchange. The friendship between the people of Taiwan and America is a matter of profound importance to the free world, and it is critical to maintain economic freedom, peace, and regional stability. We will honor our obligations and reiterate our commitment to our shared values, behind which all Americans are united.
It is no secret that today, the peace that we have maintained and the democracy which have worked hard to build are facing unprecedented challenges. We once again find ourselves in a world where democracy is under threat, and the urgency of keeping the beacon of freedom shining cannot be understated.
A meeting like that with those kinds of comments would seem not to be terribly controversial with any other country, but when it comes to Taiwan, of course, it risks the wrath of China, which says that Taiwan is part of Chinese territory and wants to bring it back under the sway of the Chinese Communist Party, much as it has Hong Kong, despite having promised Hong Kong autonomy for 50 years. McCarthy had thought of going to Taiwan himself, following in the footsteps of the former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, who took a trip there last year, triggering the most volcanic response from China ever to such a meeting. But McCarthy, in the end, decided to meet her on U.S. territory when she was in transit, as they say. It wasn't an official visit. She met with nobody from the Biden administration. But she did meet with the Speaker, the third-ranking American in line for the White House. Significant event, Kate. How do you think the Speaker handled this?
Paul, I think this was a pretty big success. To your point, I think there was a good move here to host it on U.S. soil during her transit to the U.S., but also the Reagan Presidential Library is an evocative location for such an event. You know the Reagan line that freedom is never more than one generation from extinction. Well, a lot of voices are thinking more about that question right now. I was struck by a couple things. One core takeaway was how much kind of broad bipartisan agreement there was on the subject. You had, for instance, Seth Moulton, a Democrat, basically say, there's the CCP, Taiwan, and the U.S. Two of those parties don't want war. And our mission here is to deter the third. And I think that is a good message. And I think you saw a pretty durable political broad agreement on supporting the island on a number of fronts. You also had just Republicans really focused on the subject, which is hard to do these days, avoiding getting bogged down in Donald Trump's presidential indictment and other subjects, and kind of focusing the public attention on why supporting Taiwan matters. So I think this was a big success. And we even saw Nancy Pelosi, the Democratic former Speaker of the House, basically say that this was a success and a good visit on McCarthy's part.
Yeah, when I saw that Pelosi statement come over my email, I almost fainted dead over. She almost never says anything nice maybe has never said anything nice about Kevin McCarthy. And yet she did speak that this was historic, and she's right. Now, of course, she had done it herself last year, and she's been very stalwart in her support for Taiwan. Interesting, Kim, the McCarthy visit wasn't the only one that Tsai made with American political figures. She also met in New York with Senators Dan Sullivan, Joni Ernst, and Democrat Mark Kelly when she was here, and she spoke at a Hudson Institute event with about a couple hundred Americans. There was a quiet visit. They didn't broadcast that, and the senators didn't disclose it until days later. But all of this trip has been, though it was her seventh, I think, in transit to the United States since she became president. She's now at the end of her second term. The contacts have ratcheted up, and I think that illustrates the degree to which there is an urgency in demonstrating American support on the part of officials in both parties for Taiwan.
Yeah, I think everybody gets a lot of credit here, those senators you mentioned. She also met with Hakeem Jeffries, the minority leader in the House. Everybody was on the same page and trying to handle this both as a show of support, but with a certain amount of delicacy so that they were not needlessly antagonizing or blowing up the system. As you noted, these were called a transit visit. I noted that in McCarthy's speech that he was very careful about the bond between the people of Taiwan and the United States. This was a nod to the fact that there's no formal diplomatic relations between the countries. But I think what's just as important as the show, Paul, and you're right, this comes in a very heightened situation in which China is becoming more and more belligerent, was some of the substance that was discussed. It got a little overshadowed in the symbolism. Apparently, a big point of discussion between Tsai and McCarthy was how to increase Taiwan's defenses, what the U.S. can do. Last year, Congress passed this 5-year pilot program that was designed to give billions more in training and weapons assistance, but it never was funded as intended. So there was some discussion about how we get that back on track. I think just as important, and I think this is a criticism of the Biden administration, and very interesting to me, is that apparently Tsai spent a lot of time saying, yes, care very much about the defense part, but can we talk about trade? And this is obviously a neglected aspect of the Biden administration's Asia policy, is just completely abandoned the field there. And I was really glad to see that she was raising this, really pointing out what a message that would send to China if the U.S. were developing its economic ties with other countries in the region, and also economically beneficial too. So just pointing out that this comes at a heightened time, but what I liked seeing here was the way it was handled.
Yeah, a really interesting point about trade, Kim. The U.S. and Taiwan do not have a free trade agreement, believe it or not, despite it being one of the, I think, top 10 trade partners with the United States. And, of course, the single major source of semiconductors that go into all kinds of products and technology. But the Biden administration is just petrified of trade. I mean, they're just dead in the water. They haven't improved much of anything from Donald Trump. And I think it's politically they're just afraid to do it. And you should hear some of my Democratic sources talk about it that off the record, unfortunately, about
it's such a lost opportunity.
About just how they score the administration for that. And it's a shame because I think they could get something done with the Republicans here if they wanted to now, but they have shown no interest in doing so. Kate, what do you make of the China response? It's been more muted than it was after the Pelosi visit.
Yeah, Paul, I mean, after the Pelosi visit, we saw China conduct some live fire exercises that were pretty belligerent. We're still watching a little bit closely. We have seen a couple interesting developments. There is potentially China may try to do law enforcement inspections of ships in the Strait. I'd say a couple things about this that are important. It's a reminder that China commands a very large naval fleet that is not limited to its military vessels. It includes a Coast Guard and just a huge constellation of vessels that are supposedly designed for law enforcement, but really are about bullying and intimidating neighbors. So that is a delicate situation that we'll have to watch and follow to see if they go through with any of that. We've also seen China deploy a carrier east of the island, but we are seeing perhaps a little bit more of a muted response than we did to Pelosi's visit and those live fire exercise. I do think we should also think about what's going to come out of this on the U.S. side. And when we talk about bipartisanship and the durable consensus, that really does need to translate into some important priorities, not just Kim's great point of making sure we follow up on funding some of the things we've authorized, but also we've got a backlog on foreign military sales. Our foreign military sales process is just not equipped for how quickly we need to move on Taiwan. We need to be doing a lot more pre-stocking of munitions in Taiwan because it's an island, and in any crisis, it wouldn't be easy to resupply. And we also need to be working on our own inventories of specific systems like submarines that really change China's calculus. But all of this is very doable even in divided government, because there is some broad agreement here that we need to help Taiwan deter any further aggression. And I've just listed several things that we can do at a pretty decent price point and under a bipartisan divided government.
And strikingly, Kate and Kim, this is being led by Congress. You have people like Seth Moulton, the Democrat from Massachusetts, a military veteran, sober guy, joining Kevin McCarthy, Speaker. You have Mike Gallagher, the Wisconsin representative, leading the committee on looking into China that the Republican House set up after they took power. And they're the ones that are pushing for this. The Biden administration really doesn't say very much. Now, partly this is because they don't want to get into even more difficult bipartisan relationship with China. But it should strike the Chinese government, and they pay very close attention to American politics, that they have developed this consensus. And I say they developed this consensus because it is the Chinese actions and the Chinese words and the Chinese threats that have, I think, made members of both parties and across the ideological spectrum, not everybody, there's still some isolationists on the left and right, but across most of the political spectrum that Taiwan needs our support urgently to deter China. And we don't want to go to war to China, but we do want to deter it. One other point, Kim, and this is about Chinese relations with Taiwan. There's an election coming up to replace President Tsai in January. And China, the last time there was an election, it's never been fond of President Tsai and wanted to defeat him, but it ended up doing the opposite by its incursions into Hong Kong and its crackdown on any democracy protests and support in Hong Kong. And that helped drive the support for Tsai, and she won an even bigger victory. And the reason that is because Hong Kong was also promised autonomy by the Chinese. Taiwan wasn't promised autonomy, but it is practicing it. And it doesn't want to give that up because it's now seeing at all the Hong Kong small d Democrats who are in prison and facing very long prison sentences on so-called national security charges. So China does have to be careful not to overdo it in this interim here before the election, because it could drive more support away from the party, the opposition party that China would prefer to win, which has been more pro-China.
And that's why you may see this more muted response. Even as Tsai was doing this trip, the leader of that opposition party was mainland China, instead putting attention on the ties between Taiwan and China and very much offering the alternate view. But there is certainly a feeling among the Taiwanese citizens of fear that they could become next and follow in Hong Kong's footsteps. That's still very much in their memory. If they were to now witness a repeat of China's actions after Pelosi went to visit, missile drills over the island, the simulation of a blockade, this was to happen again, I think it would re-cement in many people's eyes the real threat of going with that opposition party. And it's another reason why this Tsai trip was so important, because while there may not be diplomatic relations between the country, the mere sight for many Taiwanese people of seeing that the United States has resolve and is going to potentially have its back going forward, and at least in terms of attempting to protect itself and shoring up its defenses, just that solidarity, it may make people feel a little bit more confident in this election, not feel intimidated by some of China's threats.
All right, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to tell you about an episode in North Carolina, which is intriguing about politics, and particularly the politics of school choice, when we come back.